Daniel Carter had always been the quiet, reserved type in high school. Growing up in a small, run-down house on the outskirts of town, his family had never been rich. He didn't fit in with the wealthy kids who ruled the school, kids like Ethan Monroe and his gang of bullies. They had everything: money, popularity, and power, while Daniel had little more than his dreams. The constant mocking, the cruel jokes, and the whispers behind his back became a part of his daily life. Yet, despite the torment, he never fought back. He kept his head down, focusing on his studies and doing whatever he could to escape from the pain. When graduation day finally arrived, Daniel knew it was his chance to leave. He joined the military, eager to break free from the town that had never understood him. Over the years, he transformed into a man of strength and discipline, no longer the shy boy they once knew, but a battle-hardened war veteran. But when the invitation to his high school reunion arrived years later, Daniel found himself torn. Could he really face those who had tormented him, especially now that he was someone completely different? The envelope that arrived at Daniel's doorstep was thick, the gold lettering unmistakable. It was an invitation to his high school reunion, something he never expected to receive. Daniel stared at the invitation for a long moment, his fingers tracing the words. High school had been a time of quiet suffering for him, a period he'd tried to forget. Yet there it was, a reminder of his past, sent to him years later when he had long since moved on. He hesitated, unsure whether he wanted to relive those memories, but curiosity tugged at him. How had his classmates turned out? Was Ethan still the smug, entitled bully he remembered? And what about the others, the ones who had looked down on him without a second thought? Daniel had changed. He wasn't the shy, awkward teenager they had all known. His years in the military had shaped him into a man of confidence, discipline, and strength. The quiet, unnoticed boy from high school had become someone who commanded attention without trying. He wasn't the kid anyone picked on anymore. The thought of walking into that reunion, seeing the shocked expressions on their faces, made him feel a strange sense of power. After a long pause, Daniel made up his mind. He would go. For better or worse, he would face his past, this time on his own terms. The reunion was held at a luxurious venue, a lavish ballroom tucked away in the heart of the city. The kind of place where chandeliers glittered above, and the laughter of the rich and powerful filled the air. Ethan Monroe, the very same Ethan who had made Daniel's life miserable back in high school, had clearly spared no expense. His family's wealth was on full display, with every detail of the event meticulously planned. As Daniel walked into the venue, the first thing he noticed was how much had changed. His classmates, now in their 30s, were mostly unrecognizable. Some of them had lost the youthful charm they once carried. Others had become more polished and self-assured. Daniel stood for a moment by the door, watching as people mingled, catching up with old friends. His heart raced as he scanned the room. Then, a few people glanced in his direction. It was almost comical, the shock on their faces as they tried to place him. He was no longer the quiet, awkward teenager they had once known. He had changed. He had grown stronger, more confident, with the aura of a man who had seen the world and lived through hardships. Some of the former students quickly walked up to him, their faces filled with surprise. "Daniel Carter? Wow, you've really changed," one of them said, eyeing him with a mix of admiration and confusion. Another, who had once mocked him relentlessly, apologized for how things had gone back then. "I'm sorry for what I said to you," she stammered, her face flushed with genuine regret, but as Daniel's eyes swept the room, they landed on the familiar faces of Ethan and his gang, Liam, Jason, and Travis. They were standing by the bar, a little older but still carrying the same arrogance they had in high school. Their smiles were the same smug grins, though they now seemed to lack the self-assurance they once had. Ethan's eyes locked with Daniel's, and for a brief moment there was a flicker of something: fear, guilt. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a veneer of indifference. "Well, well, if it isn't the ghost from high school," Ethan said with a forced laugh, clearly trying to mask his discomfort. His tone was condescending, but it was clear he was no longer the untouchable bully he used to be. The others followed suit, making snide comments but avoiding eye contact with Daniel. The tension in the air was palpable. Some classmates genuinely seemed to feel remorse, but Ethan and his friends remained dismissive, as if nothing had ever happened. Daniel wasn't sure whether to laugh or feel pity. After all these years, the same group that had once tormented him was still trying to put on an act. Only this time, Daniel wasn't the scared kid they once knew. As the night wore on, Daniel found himself trying to enjoy the odd conversations and polite small talk with former classmates, but the atmosphere in the room was far from light-hearted. He noticed Ethan and his group huddled in a corner, their faces tight with tension, eyes darting around nervously. Their usual arrogance had melted away, replaced by something more unsettling. They whispered among themselves, speaking in hushed tones, but Daniel caught a few fragmented words. "Victor," Ethan muttered, his voice low but urgent. "We can't keep putting him off. He'll come for us if we don't." Daniel raised an eyebrow, intrigued. He'd never heard of Victor, but the fear in Ethan's voice was unmistakable. It was unlike anything Daniel had ever seen in him before. Ethan, the untouchable king of high school, now appeared like a man on the verge of collapse. The murmurs continued, and Daniel, with his military training and sharp instincts, listened carefully. He overheard bits and pieces of the conversation, something about a dangerous loan shark, someone named Victor, and a debt they owed that had spiraled out of control. They had borrowed money from Victor's operation to fund a business venture that had failed miserably. Now the money was due, and Victor didn't seem like the kind of person who let people off the hook. Before Daniel could process everything, the door to the ballroom suddenly swung open, and two men stepped inside. They were tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in dark suits that made them look like they belonged in a different world entirely. Their cold eyes scanned the room until they locked onto Ethan and his friends, who were now visibly shaking. Without a word, the two men made their way through the crowd, pushing past startled guests. The tension was thick as they reached Ethan's group. One of the men, a scarred individual with a gruff voice, spoke up. "Victor sent us. You owe him money, now." The air in the room seemed to freeze as the reality of the situation hit home. Ethan and his friends went pale, their usual bravado gone. They tried to speak, to make excuses, but the words came out choppy and panicked. We just need more time," Ethan pleaded, his voice shaky. "Please, Victor will understand. Time's up," the other man interrupted coldly, his voice like ice. "He's not a patient man, and you know what happens when people don't pay." The fear on Ethan's face was clear now. His hands shook, and for the first time in years, Daniel saw him not as a bully, but as a man who had lost control of everything. His once confident demeanor had shattered. The two men turned, eyes scanning the room for the next move. For a brief, tense moment, the silence was deafening. Then, Ethan's eyes darted to Daniel, a look of desperation crossing his face. "Please, Daniel, you're ex-military, right?" Ethan's voice trembled as he stepped closer. You've dealt with people like this, right? You know how to handle them. You have to help us. We don't know what to do." The arrogance was gone. In its place was a pleading raw fear that Daniel had never expected to see from Ethan. The same man who had tormented him for years, who had humiliated him in front of everyone, was now begging for his help. Jason, Liam, and Travis, equally terrified, joined in, their faces twisted with fear. We're sorry for what we did to you back then," Liam stammered. "We know we were wrong, but please, you have to help us. You're the only one who can get us out of this." Daniel stood still, absorbing their pleas. The once powerful bullies, now vulnerable, desperate, were at his mercy. He had been the target of their cruelty, and now, for the first time in his life, they were the ones looking to him for salvation. The world had turned upside down, and Daniel was left with a decision that would change everything. Daniel stood motionless, the weight of the decision before him heavier than anything he had ever faced. His mind raced, torn between conflicting emotions. Here they were, the same people who had made his life hell during his high school years, now pleading for his help. It was hard to reconcile the terrified, desperate faces before him with the arrogant, bullying figures he had once known. His fists clenched involuntarily as memories of their taunts and ridicule flooded back. He could still hear their cruel laughter, see the smug expressions on their faces as they tormented him. The idea of helping them, after everything they had done, felt wrong on a deep, primal level. Yet, despite the bitterness that bubbled inside him, Daniel could also see their fear. These weren't the same cocky bullies, they were just people in over their heads, caught in a dangerous situation of their own making. Ethan, despite his tough act, was visibly shaking. His bravado was a thin mask over the fear that had taken root in him. His usual confident swagger had been replaced with the helplessness of a man facing a nightmare he couldn't escape. We didn't mean for it to go this far," Ethan said, his voice cracking. "Please, you've got to help us. We didn't know Victor was going to be like this. We just borrowed some money for the business, but everything's falling apart, and now we're stuck." Jason, who had once been one of Ethan's most loyal lackeys, spoke up. "Yeah, we thought it'd be a sure thing. We thought we could pay him back, but the business failed. Victor isn't the kind of guy you can just talk your way out of." His eyes were wide with terror, and for a moment Daniel saw the same vulnerability in him that he'd seen in the eyes of soldiers who had lost their nerve on the battlefield. The two enforcers stood silently, their expressions cold, eyes scanning the room like predators. The man with the scar on his face stepped forward, his voice low and threatening. "Enough talking. Victor wants his money, and we don't have time for games. You have till the end of the night, or we'll start making things uncomfortable." The tension in the air thickened. The entire room had fallen silent, all eyes on Daniel and the group. The enforcer's presence was like a dark cloud, casting a heavy shadow over the reunion. The other guests shifted uncomfortably, unsure of how to react. Some seemed genuinely worried for the bullies, while others were just relieved it wasn't them in trouble. But all of them were waiting for Daniel to make his move. Daniel took a deep breath, his eyes never leaving the two men. He had been in worse situations before, in combat zones far more dangerous than this reunion hall. The enforcers, despite their menacing presence, weren't as skilled as they appeared. He could tell from the way they carried themselves. No subtlety, no strategy. They were thugs, not soldiers. They were armed, but their lack of experience in real combat was obvious. He quickly assessed the situation. The scarred man was holding a knife, the other had a gun tucked into his waistband. Neither of them seemed like they'd be able to take control of a fight if it turned physical, not against someone with Daniel's training, but still, there was the risk of escalation, of the situation spiraling out of control, and if things went wrong, innocent people could get hurt. The room was still eerily silent, all eyes now on him, waiting to see if he would take action. For a moment Daniel thought about walking away, leaving the bullies to face their fate. They had made their choices, and maybe they deserved whatever was coming to them. But something inside him, something he had learned in the military, in the darkest moments of his life, stirred. People weren't always their worst actions, and sometimes, doing the right thing, meant standing up for those who had hurt you in the past. He knew what he had to do. The question was no longer whether or not to help, it was how he was going to do it. Daniel took a steadying breath, his heart calm, despite the chaos unfolding around him. He stepped forward, moving with purpose, his presence cutting through the tension in the room like a knife. The enforcers straightened, their eyes narrowing as they realized that the quiet, unassuming man they had initially dismissed was now the one standing between them and their target. He didn't flinch, he didn't hesitate. With the calm, controlled movements of a soldier, Daniel faced the scarred man who was still gripping the knife tightly. His gaze was direct, unyielding. "Listen," Daniel's voice was low but commanding, carrying a weight the enforcers weren't used to. "This ends now. You're not going to hurt anyone here." The scarred man's lip curled into a sneer, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. The other enforcer, who had been silently observing, shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable with the sudden change in the dynamic. "You don't know who you're dealing with," the scarred man growled, taking a threatening step forward, his knife glinting in the dim light. But Daniel didn't move back. He held his ground, his stance wide and confident, his eyes never leaving the man's. The enforcer lunged, slashing the knife toward Daniel's midsection, but Daniel had already anticipated the move. He sidestepped with ease, his reflexes sharp and precise, as though he'd practiced this maneuver 1,000 times. With a swift twist, Daniel grabbed the man's wrist, twisting it until the knife dropped to the floor with a clatter. The scarred man hissed in pain, trying to free himself, but Daniel's grip was unyielding. With a quick, practiced move, he disarmed the man and spun him into the nearby wall. The man staggered back, stunned by the sudden loss of control, his body crumpling to the floor. The second enforcer froze, his hand hovering near the gun at his waist. Daniel locked eyes with him, unblinking, showing no sign of fear. The enforcer's hand twitched, but he didn't make a move. There was hesitation in his eyes, doubt. He wasn't sure how this was going to play out, and he was starting to realize that this wasn't a fight he could win. The room was deathly quiet, the tension hanging thick in the air. Ethan and his friends were wide-eyed, their mouths agape as they watched Daniel handle the situation with the cool professionalism of a man who had faced far worse than this. The scarred man, now on his feet, spat blood on the floor, and shot a venomous look at Daniel. "You'll regret this," he muttered. "Victor won't forget." The second enforcer nodded, his hand still hovering near his weapon. After a moment of hesitation, he backed off, slowly raising his hands in surrender. The scarred man glared at Daniel one last time before turning and shoving his partner toward the exit. "Get out," Daniel said, his voice cold but unwavering. "Tell Victor this ends here." Without another word, the enforcers stumbled out, the door slamming behind them with a finality that left a stunned silence in the room. Daniel exhaled slowly, his body still coiled in the aftermath of the brief but intense confrontation. He glanced at Ethan and his friends, who were staring at him with a mix of awe and disbelief. The tension in the air had dissipated, leaving behind a room full of people, unsure of what they had just witnessed. For a moment no one spoke, then finally, Ethan spoke, his voice barely a whisper. You saved us. You actually saved us." Daniel didn't respond right away, he simply turned and walked away, his steps firm and resolute. He wasn't interested in their thanks, he didn't need their gratitude, he had done what he felt was right. But as he made his way toward the exit, he knew one thing for certain: this reunion, for all its awkwardness and pain, had brought him the closure he had longed for. No longer would he be the quiet, scared boy from high school. Today, he was the one who stood tall, the one in control. The past no longer had power over him. As the door slammed behind the enforcers, the room was plunged into stunned silence. The air felt heavy with disbelief, as if everyone was still processing what had just happened. No one spoke at first, no one dared to. All eyes were on Daniel, who stood calmly in the center of the room, his presence commanding and unshaken. The bullies, once so full of themselves, were now visibly humbled. Ethan, still pale, shifted uncomfortably as he locked eyes with Daniel. The arrogant swagger he had carried all these years was gone. In its place was something that looked almost like shame, as if the weight of everything he had done finally crashed down on him. He opened his mouth, struggling to find the right words. "Daniel, began, but his voice faltered, the usual confidence nowhere to be found. His gaze dropped to the floor, his shoulders slumped, as if the weight of his past had become too much to bear. Jason, Liam, and Travis exchanged uncertain looks. They were all clearly shaken, their previous arrogance dissolved into guilt and embarrassment. They too tried to speak, but each of them seemed to lack the courage to say what needed to be said. Daniel didn't say anything at first. He didn't need to. He simply looked at them, his expression firm but not unkind. Then, without a hint of gloating, he spoke calmly, his words cutting through the stillness of the room. "Now you know what it's like to feel powerless," he said, his voice steady. There was no triumph in his tone, just quiet understanding. He had been powerless for so long in their presence, and now they knew how it felt. The tables had turned, and for the first time in years, Daniel felt the weight of his past lift off his shoulders. A few classmates approached him, their faces filled with respect and admiration. They had watched in awe, as he handled the situation with such composure. Some of them, those who had once ignored or even bullied him, now saw him in a different light. As the evening went on, Daniel knew it was time to leave. He had faced his past, and in doing so had reclaimed his sense of peace. As he stepped out of the venue, the night air felt different, lighter. For the first time in a long time, he felt free from the memories that had haunted him for years. He walked away from the reunion with his head held high, a quiet sense of closure settling in his chest. He didn't need the approval of his classmates. He didn't need their apologies. He had done what was right, and that was enough. Finally, Daniel Carter was at peace with who he had become, and with the boy he had once been. As the night drew to a close, the narrator couldn't help but reflect on the unpredictable nature of life. Karma, it seemed, had a way of working its magic, and Daniel Carter was living proof. The boy who had once been mocked, belittled and forgotten, was now the one standing tall, not just physically, but mentally and emotionally. He had faced his demons, confronted the people who had tormented him, and in the process, had become the strongest person in the room, not through his fists or his military training, but through the inner strength he had forged in the fires of his past. Daniel's journey was a testament to the power of personal growth and redemption. The past had shaped him, no doubt, but it no longer defined him. He had moved beyond the scars of his high school years, finding peace in the knowledge that he was no longer the scared, quiet boy who had once endured the cruelty of others. Life had a way of turning the tables, and Daniel had learned that sometimes, the best revenge is simply living a life of integrity, strength, and courage, something no one could take away from him. Thank you for watching Daniel's incredible journey of strength, redemption, and personal growth. His story shows us how life has a way of turning the tables, and how facing our past can lead to true freedom and peace. If you found Daniel's story inspiring, don't forget to like, comment, and share this video with your friends and family. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you believe in karma and second chances? Let us know in the comments below. And if you want to see more powerful stories like this, make sure to subscribe to our channel so you never miss an update. Thank you for being part of this journey with us together. We can keep spreading stories that matter. Until next time.